Hello and welcome to Moneycontrol's budget coverage, where we bring you the latest news, the market expectations, and what to look for in the budget that comes next week. We have today with us Pranjul Bhandari, Chief India Economist at HSBC. Pranjul, a very warm welcome to you on the show. Good to have you, and we would love to hear your thoughts on the budget. So, just to
Thanks,
set
Ipana. Good to be here.
Yes. So just to set the tone of what sort of numbers are we going to look at? What are the big numbers that you will look at the budget, and what are your expectations in terms of them?
Yeah, a couple of them. One is I would just like to see what nominal GDP growth target the government is working with. I think that's very important. Sometimes they overestimate it, sometimes they underestimate it. So it'll be very important to look at that. I would like to look at on the expenditure side what kind of a capex thrust they have. In the last couple of years, the central government has done a lot of capital expenditure. Will they be able to continue it in a difficult year like FY24? Of course, I will be looking at the fiscal deficit number. The government has promised a fiscal deficit glide path, bringing it down over time. Are they sticking to that glide path? And finally, I would also be looking at the gross borrowing number. How much money is the government planning to borrow from the markets to fund its fiscal deficit? And will that go down well with markets? Is it too much or is it just about right? So these are the sort of four numbers I'll broadly be looking at.
So when you mentioned nominal GDP growth, clearly the nominal GDP growth for this year has come at a far higher, and it has been an upside, a surprising upside. So that gives the government a lot of legroom in terms of spending and still sticking to that 6.4% fiscal deficit target. So do you think that they will keep 6.4% and aim for 5.8% fiscal deficit next year, which I think is your expectation?
Yes, I think they will. I think they will. They have made it very clear in many different forums that they want to really stick to the glide path that they have announced, and I think they will. Now, when nominal GDP growth in the last year was about 15%, it was very helpful. In those kind of years, tax revenues tend to be high, so that really helped the government. But as nominal GDP falls to 9.5%, which is our forecast for FY24, then there are two kinds of problems. One is tax revenue growth also falls. And the second problem is that sometimes tax revenue growth falls more than nominal GDP growth. Many firms, they fall under the taxable threshold and the number of taxpayers also fall. So for
Right.
all of these reasons, there could be pressure on the tax revenue front. But our sense is that despite this pressure, the central government will try its best to meet the fiscal deficit target.
In your reports and the newspaper editorials that you have written, you have extensively talked about the context, the economic context under which this budget comes in. So, if you have to look back and assess the past budgets and the context in which they were presented, do you think that this one is probably the toughest in terms of striking a balance?
Look, there are going to be many challenges in this budget for the next year. One is, of course, the nominal GDP growth problem that we are discussing. That growth is going to be much lower. So, what do you do? The second is it's a pre-election year. Pre-election years are generally associated with lower privatization and more expenditure challenges, more expenditure demands, and it's harder to bring down the fiscal deficit. Then a third challenge is the fact that through the pandemic, large firms have gotten larger. We call it formalization, and because the large firms pay taxes, the government got a lot of tax money. But as the informal sector revives, and I hope it does over the next 12 months, then that tax bounty could fall off a little bit, because not all informal sector firms are in the tax net as much as the large firms. And then
Right.
there is the capex problem. The central government has worked very hard to keep the capex high. How do you bring down the fiscal deficit without cutting the capex bill? So these are challenges. But having said that, I won't call this the toughest budget, because despite this, the government has some leg room, and we can go into this in some details. In fact, I would say that the challenges will begin from next year. This year, coming down till about 5.8 is still manageable.
Okay, so when you mentioned, since you mentioned FY24, which is the next fiscal year, and it's going to be quite challenging, First off, the expectation is that the nominal GDP growth is going to considerably decelerate. I want you to maybe go a step ahead, maybe beyond FY24. How do you see nominal GDP growth, also real GDP growth panning out for India?
Look, I think FY24 is going to be a difficult year in the sense that, growth around the world is likely to slow. Many countries are even going into recession. Our exports growth are falling. In our own country, pent-up demand, which had supported consumption, is also fading. So for all of these reasons, GDP growth is likely to be much lower. This is a problem. But beyond FY24, I'm hoping global growth stabilizes, India's growth also inches up, and even inflation normalizes. So, I think FY24 from that sense will be the lowest we see for nominal GDP growth. After that, it should pick up. So, from that sense, this problem is not a permanent problem.
Okay, okay. Another thing I wanted from one of your reports is that one aspect that we have to focus on is the fiscal consolidation, which you mentioned. Um, we are looking at 5.8% and 4.5% for FY26. Now, there was an aspirational level of 3%. Now, FRBM is not a subject that's being discussed anyway post pandemic, in a post pandemic world. But is that 3% worth pursuing eventually? And you think 4.5% is achievable by FY26?
These are great questions. I think it's easy to go from 6.5 to 5.8, but I think the journey from 5.8 to 4.6 will be very hard. In the past, those journeys were done by cutting the capex. But this year, the government doesn't want to cut capex. It's one of its strengths that it's kept capex high. So how do you get from 5.8 to 4.5 without cutting capex? And I think it will be challenging. And from that perspective, 3 is really far away. And we are completely out and very far away from this FRBM world, which has not worked out for India in more than a decade. We've not been able to get a 3% fiscal deficit. Many countries around the world are having same problems, and I think at some point we will have to work with new fiscal rules. We'll have to reimagine fiscal rules. Maybe we'll have to think about medium term fiscal targets and not short run fiscal targets. There can be lots of different things we can do, but my sense is that the FRBM as we used to know it in the past is basically not applicable at this point.
Okay, I will come to those interesting bicycle analogy that you made in terms of talking about the budget in one of your reports, and you said the government has to keep pedaling hard, and the fact that past capex will kind of give the government a leg up or make it easier for them in terms of fiscal consolidation. On capex itself, I want to know your view. There is a state element to it, there is a central element to it, and then there is private capex. So, can you walk us through what you expect in terms of these three legs of capex?
Yeah, so look, it's very interesting. Central government capex has been increasing over the last 3-4 years. It's risen by about 1.2% of GDP over the last 3 years, which is good. But central government is not the only public sector entity. There's also state government, and I would argue that state governments have actually cut down their capex in the same period. So if you add up center and state, then the thrust on capex is not very much. The states, in a way, have undone all the good work that the central government has done, and then that leaves the private sector. What we are seeing in the private sector is that there are some capex indicators that are rising. My sense is that large firms have started investing. It's not an across the board investment. It's sort of top tier large firms who have gained through the pandemic, whose balance sheets look very strong. But we'll have to see how it progresses, because right now most of it is actually in value terms, not even in volume terms. So maybe a lot of it is just inflation. But large firms have started doing some capex.
Okay. Since we're talking about capex, are there any specific measures you think that the budget can do next week? The finance minister can do to sort of awaken the animal spirits in terms of private capex?
Look, a private capex requires macro and economic stability. I think the best thing we can do is to keep stable and predictable tax rates, no big policy shocks, because capex doesn't do well, when there are shocks in the system. So almost, I would say, a boring budget is a good budget, without any shocks. And the second thing, capex thrives at a period of macro stability, where inflation is low, interest rates are predictable, exchange rates are stable. So everything the budget can do to preserve macro stability. And I think one important part of preserving macro stability is bringing down the fiscal deficit. And that's one of the reasons why sticking to the glide path is so important. You bring down fiscal deficit, it's one way to enhance macro stability. And once macro stability is enhanced, over time, investments come on their own. They get the confidence and they come in on their own, and it's good for growth.
Okay, so in essence, the government just needs to stick to its tax policy, simplify it, which is what the market wants, but not shake it up so much that private sector companies start rethinking what they want to do in terms of capex.
That's correct, yes.
Pranjul, I want to come to the broad topic of the economy itself, the background of the budget and monetary policy in this case. I wanted to get your thoughts on the K-shaped recovery that we have seen. So, in your view, do you think that like the 20% top that consumes is enough for the economy to grow? Because the top 20% consumption is decelerating, but is the bottom of the economy enough for consumption demand to sustain?
No, a great question, Aparna. I've been arguing for a long time that we've gone through a K-shaped recovery, and no, it's not good enough, because the upper echelons, the high earners, a lot of the consumption they do is imported goods. So there, a lot of the benefits don't trickle down to the bottom of the pyramid. And also, they are not very large number of people. In our country, almost 60 to 70% people work in the informal sector. So you can't have the informal sector, struggling and only a few doing well. It just doesn't give you sustainable growth. But from that perspective, I think FY24, the next 12 months, are going to be better than the last few years. And the reason is that we are seeing signs of rural recovery. And I'm also hoping that the informal sector, which has faced back to back shocks, first the lockdowns and then the commodity price shock, also bounces back to some extent in FY24. So once we have rural demand recovering and the informal sector bouncing back a little bit, even if growth overall slows in FY24, my hope is that it is spread more evenly, and I think that is a good thing, because over time, that makes a case for sustainable growth.
So, since you brought the rural demand picture front and center, the government's focus on social schemes, which took off in a big way during the pandemic, they have scaled back now since the pandemic's effects are more or less over to some extent. But LPG, free food, health insurance, subsidized housing, is it enough to increase the consumption on the rural side, or do you think there are some other levers that are required?
Yeah. Look, you don't need only government schemes to buoy growth. I think there are lots of other sources of income, and there are other drivers of growth. I think at this point, thankfully, so far, the Rabi crop is in a good place. Sowing has been strong. And if there are no adverse weather shocks, like last year's March heat wave, and right now we are seeing wheat prices higher than MSP. Then when the cultivators go and sell their crop in the market, I think they will be earning some money, and that will be good for rural demand. So I think the rains are helping out, at this point. And overall, if at some point the construction sector picks up, a lot of rural India does work in the construction sector, I think that will help as well. So, I would say that government schemes are only something to fall back on in, for example, a famine year, or at a time when real estate is in doldrums. But it's not really is something that can drive growth over time. For driving growth over time, you need a much more productive agriculture sector, much more productive real estate sector, and also manufacturing.
Right, and that brings us to the factor that has been a big issue globally also, and for us, is that climate events. These are black swans. We still don't have, at least India, and we can assume that we don't have the infrastructure to accurately predict how the weather will be. So that is a sword hanging on in terms of the agriculture output. Um what sort of policy measures you think should be taken, or is this something that can be handled, or that we just leave it at God's hands?
Yeah, before I answer that, it's a great point you've brought up, and we've done a lot of work on the impact of climate change on inflation. And we find that rainfall patterns are changing, sowing patterns are changing, food prices are becoming far more volatile, and on the back of that, household inflation expectations is now remaining much more sticky at high levels. All of this is a problem because what it essentially does is, it pushes out the Phillips curve. For every level of growth you now have to live with a higher level of inflation, and these are things that are actually playing a havoc at this point. I think one of the reasons why core inflation has remained high and sticky for so long is because inflation expectations has just been so high for so long. So these are new things we have to grapple with. I think central banks around the world are grappling with this. Over time, the RBI will have to work under these constraints, and I think there'll have to be ways it works out. One of them could be that it starts hiking rates early on, because if you do early hikes, then eventually you don't have to do too much hikes. So it'll have to find different techniques to deal with a period of climate change.
Right. Okay. One aspect of rural consumption demand is the wages side of it. What do you see there? What's your assessment, current assessment in terms of wages, and going forward?
Okay, great. I break down rural India into three parts. One is the cultivators, the landowners. The second is the landless agricultural workers, and the third is the landless construction workers. Now, the middle gang, the agriculture wage earners, they're actually doing very well right now. Agricultural wages in real terms have surpassed pre-pandemic levels over the last 2 months. So I would say one third of rural India has begun to do well. Now, when the cultivators, the landowners, they sell their wheat produce in the market and they earn money, and wheat prices are higher than MSP, then even they will start doing well. So I think from about March, April, about two-thirds of rural India will start seeing an uptick, and I think that will be positive at least for the next couple of months.
Okay. Another thing is, I mean, if we come from rural to semi-urban and those centers, the government's PLI schemes has, it seeks to inspire, it seeks to push private companies to set up factories that generates employment. How will this help in terms of consumption demand eventually, or what sort of impact do you see in terms of investments itself?
Right. Look, anything I think which makes the manufacturing sector grow is going to be good for jobs in employment demand and growth. India's big problem has been that our manufacturing sector has remained very small for very long, and that is a worry. So, if to the extent PLI scheme encourages investment, and on the back of that manufacturing picks up somewhat, I think it's positive. But my point here is that maybe PLI scheme is not it's good, but it's not sufficient. You need more. You need more sort of policies which make it easier to manufacture in India. We have a lot of regulatory cholesterol, a lot of problems on the labor front, on the land front. We are trying to improve it, but a lot more needs to be done. And until we do that, I don't think just one scheme like PLI can really change India's fortunes in a very grand manner.
So, do you think that at least in the union budgets in the past years, maybe the next week's budget as well, do you think that there is a space, or there is at least some intention should be specifically shown towards boosting employment? I mean, it's a policy statement that every finance minister makes. But some concrete measures that could be announced, because this seems to be a big area of discussion right now.
Right. Aparna, for me, an economy where investments are happening is an economy in which capacity is being added and therefore jobs are being created and wages, are rising. So for me,
Okay.
investment is the motherboard. Any policy that encourages investment is good for jobs. And from that perspective, I think, as we've discussed earlier, I think the best thing that can be done is to have predictability and clarity in terms of tax, no big changes or U-turns in any of the policies, and basically keeping macro stability strong. And I think if the budget can actually do that, on its own, private sector investment will rise. Today, there's a lot of excitement in India. Bank balance sheets are in a good place, corporate balance sheets are in a good place. I think couple of right things here and there like macro stability, and I do believe private capex, will take off, which over time is good for jobs.
Two last questions. One is you mentioned import tariffs as a big impediment. I want to know your thoughts about that. If you can, elaborate on what do you mean by that and how the government can actually go ahead and make it more easier in terms of doing business in India, giving domestic business a boost and the PLI schemes as well.
Right. So, look, one thing that has happened in the last couple of years is huge implosion of import tariffs. Every budget we see, several goods on which import tariffs are raised, and I think it starts with a good place that we are going to support some domestic industry, but what it ends up doing is increasing the cost base of the economy. In fact, I would argue that even the mobile handset industry is today complaining that on the one hand, you're giving us a PLI scheme, which is a 5% subsidy, but on the other hand, you're slapping so many, import tariffs on items we have to import, like mobile phone screens, that the benefit of the PLI subsidy is actually going away. So I think this is one strategy, I'm not a big fan of slapping so many import tariffs. If we can do a U-turn on that and go back to where we were several years ago, where we were focusing on bringing down tariffs rather than increasing them, I think we will be in a good place.
Final question, Pranjal, on the other side, which is exports. So exports, the push that exports gave to growth in the last couple of years is not going to be the case because we know what is happening globally as well. But in terms of not export policy, but in terms of approach to exports, you think that the budget can offer any special SOPs or tax reliefs or any such special measures so that the exports do not suffer to the extent that they are expected to, or will it not matter at all because globally demand is actually decelerating?
Right. I think the best thing we can do for exports right now is try to keep the rupee competitive.
Okay.
And I think on this front, there was a case when the RBI was, very actively involved in the FX market. The rupee was actually strengthening on a relative basis compared to other countries. But my sense is that since October, the rupee has actually weakened compared to its trading partners, and I think that's the right strategy. On the margin, that makes India's exports cheaper to the world. It incentivizes exports, and I think that's the best thing we can do at a time when, generally speaking, global growth is weak. So I think since October, we are doing the right thing on encouraging exports via the rupee.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pranjal, for joining us and giving a lowdown of what the budget should be doing in terms of boosting India's economy and how the government should actually look at its fiscal deficit. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
1st February 2023, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the last full union budget before 2024 elections. India's most awaited financial event comes in the midst of global slowdown, inflation, liquidity tightening, geopolitical tensions, and re-emergence of COVID-19. Will India look to fire up its manufacturing? Will India build a moat against global uncertainties? What will the budget have for the middle class? Watch the complete coverage of Budget 2023. Real-time analysis, expert takes all day on Moneycontrol. Log on to www.moneycontrol.com for more.